Here we are. We're at part 2 now of the axial skeleton in the overall chapter 7 skeleton, and we're on page 219. And let's come back down here again to our picture. We have a lateral view that is got a little section here that is also mid-sagittal in nature. But we've learned so far about the anterior longitudinal ligament that runs the full-length anterior surface of the spinal column. These are bodies of the vertebra, so along the anterior body. And of course we have the interior of the pharynx here. At the very high end we have the anterior of the thorax, the interior of the abdominal region. So that's sort of, it's not something we can palpate. In other words, then we have our posterior longitudinal ligament, and that runs the length of the vertebral canal. And then we have our ligamentum flavum in the posterior of the intervertebral canal. And it also links up the lamina. And ultimately, if you're going to do a, how shall I say, a dermal puncture of one kind or another to either deliver anesthesia or to take cerebrospinal fluid, you're going to have to avoid the center here, which is the interspinous and supraspinous ligaments, and you'll come over to the side and you'll go through between the two lamina through the ligamentum flavum. Okay, and you'll feel a little snap and you'll know that you're in there. Okay, meanwhile, the spinous processes themselves are being held together by, mostly you can feel the supraspinous ligament up in the neck region, and it's referred to as the nuchal ligament in the neck region. Certain animals, like horses, have really prominent nuchal ligaments from which hanging down are their mane, right? And we have a nuchal ligament, and it's important to us partly because we have rotational movements from side to side. With our head, we scan the horizon. So all of these things are important. We also have suboccipital muscles that are going to move things in a lateral sort of head-turning kind of way. Okay, so this is the support system. Let's press on. And here's something that happens if the vertebra lose their orientation with one another, and under weight-bearing circumstances, it's possible that the disc between them becomes, how shall I say, stressed and traumatized, and the nucleus pulposus might actually sort of herniate in one direction or another. If it herniates against this nerve right here, you can see that it will interrupt that nerve, and there's going to be problems, distal or also proximal in terms of sensory. So distal in terms of motor, proximal in terms of sensory. Okay, our spinous process here, our transverse processes, and so on. Here's our disc. Notice that we have what's referred to here as an annulus fibrosus, which is the fibrocartilage. Okay, then we come down here to observe a typical vertebra, and also we learn about the growth centers and the way in which a vertebra grows, which is a very complex type of bone structure. And it has 3 growth centers. The first one is here in the body, and the growth of the body proceeds, and then it follows a particular pattern in a sort of diagonal manner up here. We have secondary growth centers here and here, and they grow toward each other, or that is to say the body and the transverse process here grows toward each other. And in order to close that space right here, which we're going to be calling a pedicle. Okay, and then these growth centers also grow together, and they kind of like push together, almost like you're pushing the 2 crusts of a pie together and pinching them at the top, as it were. right? And so this portion right here and right here are referred to as lamina. And the way I would describe that is that when the growth center of the transverse process grows together with the growth center of the body, they form the pedicle. And when the two transverse growth centers grow together in the posterior direction, they form the spinous process. So we have that sense of articulation of the system. Okay? And then we go on to the particulars of all of this. And let's take a look here. Okay. We're over now on page 221. And we're looking at C1 and C2. These are unique vertebra because they lack certain things. One thing that C1 lacks is sort of a body. This is the anterior here, and this is the posterior. It's also sort of lacking a very significant spinous process. So it's a much simpler feature. It's not bearing as much weight as other bones in the body, and so it's a little bit more delicate. It does have this huge superior articular facet which holds the skull, and so we give it the name atlas, which is sort of like we're holding the world on our shoulders right there, or at least the shoulders of this particular vertebra. Okay, and then we look at the other side of the situation. Again, anterior, posterior. We have a unique feature here, which is a transverse foramen going through the transverse process. And all 7 cervical vertebrae have this particular feature in which the vertebral artery is actually passing through along with the vertebral vein. And then another feature here is that we have an annular ligament right here. And it surrounds a particular bone that's pushed up that way, and that's this one right here. And so when we go to C2, which is referred to as the axis, we again have a superior, and then you can't quite see it, the inferior process. We do have a slightly more formed spinous process. We do have a definite body, but then we seem to have something on top of the body, which in essence we've sort of, you can see C2 has taken what would have been the body, perhaps, of C1 and placed it right here. And we're going to be calling this the dens or the odontoid process. Okay, the dens is easier to say probably. And the dens fits up here. Okay, and it is below the C1, and then C1 is going to rotate around the dens. So that's part of the program here. And we're over here on page 221. Okay. So as we proceed on, here we have that configuration. Okay, so we have C1 is this guy right here. And you can see that C1 does have that transverse ligament. And you can see that C2 is right here. And C2 is sending its dens up against the anterior aspect here of the C1 vertebra. And then C1 is wrapping that dens with a transverse ligament. Okay? So the dens are the odontoid process. Okay, and of course C1 can spin from side to side. Okay, it can pivot. Okay, then you'll also notice that all of these spinous processes are bifid, and I'm going to describe how the formation of spinous processes and pedicles differ, actually also how lamina differ. Okay, but we'll get to that eventually. There are 7 of these. Notice that the spinous process is going to become bigger as we move toward the prominence, C7. Okay, all of these are going to be having transverse foramina. So that's the deal, and that's our cervical vertebra.